Hello, anatomy colleagues. This is Dr. Alsip, and we're going to continue our discussion on skeletal muscle basics with connective tissue. And a lot of time we think of the muscle cells, we think of that kind of reddish muscle belly, but connective tissue plays such a huge role in terms of the skeletal system, both on the microscopic as well as the macroscopic or gross level. All right, so we have a few learning objectives that we're going to touch on. We're going to start at the smallest scale or the most microscopic scale. Then we're going to increase in size and visibility, ending with tendons and fascia, the all-important fascia. Okay, so connective tissue, again, as I mentioned, we are starting at the most microscopic level with the endomysium. Sometimes you'll hear endomysium, but really endomysium is going to be the correct way. And you can see kind of endo, so you're thinking kind of more inside here. And this is going to surround each muscle fiber or each one of those individual muscle cells. So if we're looking at this kind of blown up illustration here, you can see you're looking at one myofiber that's been kind of enlarged here. You have all those myofibrils throughout. And then surrounding that fiber, or that muscle cell, is going to be a layer of connective tissue that surrounds it. Okay, so already at this really small scale, we have connective tissue associated with muscle. And it plays a role because it brings in neurovasculature of great importance. That vasculature is going to supply nutrients to allow for a lot of that function to occur in this region. Now, moving a little bit larger scale, or a little, not generally, it can be visible, is going to be the paramecium. And it is continuous with that endomysium. And so you can see, so this was the kind of close-up picture here. We're going to focus more on this picture here. This is like the full muscle belly, one that you would see. And what the paramecium does is it surrounds these regions referred to as fascicle. And fascicle is a new term for us. Basically, this is going to be groups of muscle fibers or muscle cells that are kind of grouped up together and surrounded by connective tissue, specifically this paramecium. And you may have seen fascicles before if you're ever looking at some type of meat that's been cooked and it's kind of pulled apart into these kind of bundles. Those are fascicles. And the shiny part that's surrounding those fascicles is the connective tissue, which is the paramecium. Again, paramecium is going to be continuous with the endomysium, as well as the larger or more macroscopically visible epimecium. And the epimecium is going to surround the entirety, the whole muscle belly. All right, so if you've ever looked at, say, a dissected muscle, generally there is some shiny, kind of sometimes it's a little translucent connective tissue surrounding it. That is the epimecium. It's thicker than the connective tissue associated with the smaller scale myofiber or even around those fascicles. And it will surround and bind all those fascicles or those bundles of muscle fibers together into one muscle belly, and then that's surrounded by connective tissue. Now, this is a key point. I've been mentioning it throughout, but make sure that you understand this, that all this connective tissue is continuous. So that endomysium is continuous with the paramecium, which is continuous with the epimecium, and the epimecium is continuous with tendons. And you've likely heard tendons before. And this is, unlike ligaments, ligaments, remember, are bone to bone, connecting bone to bone. Tendons connect the muscle belly to bone. Okay, so hugely important in terms of movement. And really, it's just that continuation of the connective tissue past the muscle. All right, you can kind of see that here. Here's the epimecium that's surrounding the muscle belly. And at some point, the muscle belly kind of stops, but you still have a continuation of connective tissue, and that is the tendon. How long the tendon is, how wide the tendon is, the shape, size of the tendon varies quite a bit between muscles, but you're always going to have some level of that connective tissue between the actual muscle and bone. And what's key here and really important is that that tendon will, as mentioned, attach to the bone, but what it does is it actually kind of it's continuous with that the periosteum that's surrounding the outside of the bone, and it will actually kind of interweave and blend with the collagen of the osseous extracellular matrix. So if you think of a muscle contracting, that's going to kind of bring the tendon with it. And since it's so intimately connected to the bone, that will allow the bone to move and to get some of those major skeletal movements we have. Again, as mentioned, we can have all different shapes and sizes of tendons. Sometimes they're really rope-like. Sometimes you can't even really see the tendon, but rest assured it's there. It's like right up against the bone. You can have these regions referred to as aponeuroses, and this kind of just means a flat sheet of tendon. And one of the most obvious ones are associated with the palm of the hand, and you can see this here on a dissection, this palmar aponeurosis. So very different than, say, the more rope-like tendons that we tend to think of. A few characteristics. Generally, tendons are highly organized in terms of the directionality of their collagen fibers, okay? So they very often will appear very opaque. Sometimes, depending on how thin an aponeurosis, it might become a little more translucent, but for the most part, tendons are fairly opaque. These, similar to what we had with cartilage, are they're poorly vascularized. So anytime you have poor vascularization, there tends to be a slowness to healing. So if you have damage to a tendon, it's a little bit slower to heal than, say, other regions. And also, even though obviously that connective tissue surrounded certain components of the muscle, that endo, peri, and epimecium, that surrounded portions of the muscle, once that muscle belly ends, and tendons do not have muscle cells associated with them. So it's really just this highly organized collagen fibers going to connect to bone. Now, tendons are also generally going to have some connection to fascia. And fascia is a more generalized term. It just means this grossly visible connective tissue that serves to kind of, particularly when we're talking about the musculoskeletal system, will often compartmentalize groups of muscles. And often those groups of muscles are in obviously a similar location because they're kind of packaged together. But oftentimes they have a similar nerve that innervates them. They generally have similar actions, and we often call these muscle compartments. This is going to be, unlike where we had the kind of dense regular connective tissue associated with tendons, fascia tends to be dense irregular connective tissue. And you can kind of see here, if we're looking at the schematic of skin, and you'll talk about skin in a lot more detail, you have the skin right here. You'll often have a layer of superficial fascia, which is composed predominantly of fat. And then you start getting into varying levels of fascia. And that's generally often referred to as deep or investing fascia. Sometimes that epimecium is just sometimes considered a investing fascia as well. Sometimes you'll hear that term used interchangeably. But you can see here in this cross-section, you have these groupings of different muscles, and we'll talk about these specific muscles in more detail later. But you can see that these muscles are separated from other groups of muscles by a layer of fascia. And you can even see how that's going to have a connection. That fascia has a connection with those, say, the epimecium that's surrounding the muscle bellies of those individual muscles. So fascia is huge. If you ever do a dissection course, you will certainly become very familiar with fascia. It is throughout the entirety of the body, not just associated with the musculoskeletal system, but certainly also associated with MSK. All right, excellent. So I hope that you've kind of gotten across the fact that while connective tissue is not certainly muscle cells, it is so very intimately related to, even at that small scale of the cell layer, to the larger scale of the entirety of the muscle belly, all the way to its connection of the bones. And all those layers of connective tissue are going to be connected. And that's important because with any type of contraction, even at that small scale, you're still going to have that really close connection to the connective tissue, which you need in terms of overall movement. All right, excellent. Question time. Muscle tendons are closely associated with which structure of the skeletal system? All right, so look at these answer choices. If you don't get it right off the bat, you can pause and go look back at your notes. And when you're ready, let's discuss how E, the periosteum, is the correct answer. So first off, where is the periosteum? So periosteum is going to be that connective tissue layer that kind of surrounds the external surface of the bone. So if you think about a tendon that is from that muscle belly, extending from the muscle belly to the bone, it makes sense for it to be really closely connected with that periosteum. In fact, it kind of interweaves past it to become part of that, part of the matrix of the bone. Generally, a muscle tendon is not going to extend all the way to the medullary cavity. Epiphyseal plate, no, that's a joint, remember, so we're not generally going to have tendons all the way, to kind of going through, say, like the synovial cavity and that type of region there, or even at the epiphyseal plate. Certainly tendons can play a role in terms of protecting joints, but generally you're not going to have a connection straight to that region. Endosteum, also a bit too internal, similar to the medullary cavity. And the articular cartilage, same, it's not going to connect to that cartilage on the ends of bones. And to kind of go back to the epiphyseal plate and joints when I was mentioning, tendons certainly will play a huge role in terms of protection of the joints. Sometimes it can kind of serve as an added protection to portions of the joint, say like an anterior portion of a joint when we're talking about the knee. But generally, you're not going to have that tight connection to, say, directly to the cartilage of a joint. It's more playing a protective portion to the outside of the joint. And obviously, it's going to play a huge role in terms of allowing movement to occur with the contraction of muscle. Okay, excellent. So we have one more video in terms of the skeletal muscle basics, which are the different types of contraction, and then talking a little bit about prime movers and that type of stuff. So thank you so much for your time and attention here. If you have any questions, please reach out, and I'll be always happy to talk anatomy.